think you can really say that it starts with Miss Atkinson really directly advocating for the school, and that kind of spirit seems to sort of follow us throughout our history.
Susan Cobb Milton was born in Florida about 1860 into a family long associated with politics and influence.
She came from a long line of politicians. Her grandfather was governor of Florida, John Milton, and her great-great-grandfather was a major in the state of Georgia right after the Revolutionary War.
Growing up in the poverty of the Civil War and Reconstruction years, Susan was aware of the struggle of Southern women, few of whom could afford tuition at the private colleges. Without training, heavy farm labor was the only way for them to earn a living.
She went to the Lucy Cobb Institute, which is one of the best female academies, you know, because of her political background and family. I think Lucy Cobb, really gave her a sense of what possibilities were in the New South. And then that's where she met her husband.
She married at 22. She moved here to Noonan, was married to a smart, young attorney, and he was a law student at the University of Georgia. And they came back here, and he quickly advanced through the political arena.
William Atkinson quickly became county solicitor, was elected to the General Assembly, and in a few more years he was Speaker of the House. During this speedy rise, Susan kept reminding him of the plight of Georgia women, pushing him to campaign for a state college for women.
The story is that she and her husband, W.Y., were riding in a carriage through some windy country roads here in the county and noticed two young girls working out in the cotton field.
And she just felt that was so wrong, that they should be having other opportunities other than working in the hard cotton fields.
They were chopping cotton. And they saw her, and I think she was strikingly beautiful, and they were very embarrassed. And they took their bonnets and hid their faces and cried. And the quote is, she said, it broke her heart.
Susan persuaded her husband to present a bill to the House of Representatives in 1888, but the timing was not right.
But they were building a new capital in Atlanta. They were building Georgia Tech, and they just said, this is too much and all in 1 year.
She would not allow her husband to give up, and she became very instrumental. And she sent letters to at least 2 women in every county in the state, women that she knew were very influential in that area.
You start learning about, well, Miss Atkinson was directly responsible for encouraging her husband to advocate for the school to be created, and then ultimately for the school being placed here in Milledgeville.
Within the state Senate, there was a bitter fight over the location of the new college before Milledgeville was chosen.
Suddenly this General Assembly that didn't want the college was arguing about who was going to get to have it in their town. And Milledgeville won out.
The cornerstone for the college was laid in 1890. The governor appointed William Yates Atkinson chairman of the Board of Trustees and named Susan Atkinson president of the Board of Visitors, a position she would hold for many years.
Her role was on this Board of Visitors that would come not annually but periodically to make sure that everything was going well. She always was very proud of the college and was always made much of when she came.
I think the first kind of understanding I had of Miss Atkinson and her husband were that, we had this building named Atkinson Hall.
It's the oldest building, and it was named in their honor. And I really think it's not just for William Atkinson. I think people from the get-go saw she being very much of a part of this.
Susan Atkinson, even though she was from a family of privilege, worked very hard in the community and civic activities. She was president of the Ladies Memorial Association. Of course, when the soldiers were buried here, they were just makeshift markers. But in 1892, they had a plan to permanently mark all of the graves. So that was a really big effort for that time.
The next challenge for Susan Atkinson was to get her husband elected governor of Georgia. William was very young, and his opponent was a popular Confederate war hero, but he won by a landslide and was re-elected 2 years later.
There's some great newspaper articles that I have read where she receives much of the credit for her husband being elected. And so they moved to Atlanta and lived in what was the new governor's mansion and raised a family.
She's had 6 children, I believe, and I believe I knew all of them at one time. One of them was called Aunt Georgia. She was sort of the same way. She was good at whatever she did.
Unfortunately, Governor Atkinson, his last term ended in 1898. They moved back to Noonan, and he resumed his law practice here. Shortly after that, he died. And so she was left in 1899 at 41 years of age to raise 6 children.
They were in Noonan. They'd been in Noonan, Georgia all this time. So she had an insurance agency, which she ran very capably. And then she lobbied with Teddy Roosevelt to get her appointment as postmaster for Noonan.
She was quite the lady to stay busy. Supposedly went to President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, in Washington, and she was not happy with the way the post office was running.
From what I read, she didn't just want the postmaster job, she coveted the postmaster job, and she was postmistress until she was 70 years old.
But she was always just very actively involved in the community and was such an addition to Noonan even after her husband died.
Always ahead of her time, in 1905, Susan bought a red Maxwell automobile.
For one of the first that had automobiles here in Noonan, and she wasn't known to be too good a driver, so the children would have to come down and ask him, says, Miss Atkinson, are you going to take your car out this afternoon? And if she said yes, she said, well, my folks going to tell me to come back in the house.
Susan Atkinson continued to serve Georgia College for the remainder of her long life. In 1940, at the age of 80, she flew to Milledgeville for the 50th anniversary of the college's founding.
They invited Susan Atkinson to come and help them celebrate. She was going to be their guest of honor. Mr. Romberger issued an invitation for her to actually fly to Milledgeville, and she at first turned the invitation down and just decided, no, I think I'll just take my car. And I found a letter where he wrote her and called her a big sissy.
They had a Victorian carriage for her. They were really doing this thing up big, you know. And she got in the carriage to go to wherever she was to make a talk and get all her awards and honors.
They met her in the same Victorian carriage that she and her husband had ridden through the streets of Milledgeville when the college had opened in 1891.
And the horses got spooked by something and it took off. You know, I mean, she almost got thrown out of the carriage, but she was unruffled.
And they said she just kept waving. And she said later, well, after that plane trip down, the horses weren't much.
They're probably not as remembered as well as they should be. And, you know, they really need to thank them for, you know, the kind of the great institution we have here today.
She was opening the door for women to be breadwinners, and that's what she had to become.
But she was a great lady. The more you read about her, the more that you appreciate her.